Kristi Noem accused Tim Walz of lying, and the moment she said it, the entire briefing room froze. Reporters stopped typing. Cameras snapped upward, and for the next few seconds no one dared breathe. Because what followed wasn't a political disagreement or a routine statement. It was a full-blown confrontation over power, responsibility, and a tragedy that had already shaken an entire city. And the way Noem delivered it made one thing unmistakably clear: she wasn't backing down, and she wasn't softening anything for the cameras.
Enforcement are doing everything that they can to protect the public. We're praying for this deceased loved one's family and friends, but we also recognize that the Minnesota governor and the Minneapolis mayor need to take a long, hard look in the mirror. They need to evaluate their rhetoric, their conversations, and their encouragement of such violence against our citizens and our law enforcement officers. I'll remind you that Governor Walz today in his press conference said that our officers were not even law enforcement, which is a lie. He's called them the Gestapo. He's encouraged residents and citizens and violent rioters to resist. He's doxed their identities, putting themselves and their families' lives in jeopardy. He's refused to turn over murderers to federal law enforcement officers. He's protected illegal criminals and protected them from being brought to justice, and even overseen a historic, unprecedented theft of American taxpayer dollars. Tens of billions of dollars were stolen under his watch, and he allowed it to happen, and in some instances may have even facilitated it. In other cities and states across the country, we don't see this happen. Local, state, and officials work with us to make sure that we're making their streets safer. I'll point to the city of Memphis, which is where there is a Democrat mayor in place. He worked with us and our federal law enforcement officers, and we saw murder rates drop by 50% because of that partnership. We've seen historic lows in the criminal acts that have happened in that city. We've had the same amount of law enforcement officers there, but a very different result because of the leadership in place.
She opened with a claim so sharp it cut straight through the noise. The governor of Minnesota had misled the public about federal agents involved in a deadly Minneapolis confrontation, and in her view, those lies weren't just reckless, they were dangerous. According to Noem, the rhetoric wasn't only dividing the public, it was putting officers' lives at risk. And if you think that was the end of it, just wait. Because the press briefing only got more explosive from there. She didn't start gently. She didn't ease her way in. She went directly for the nerve center of the controversy, turning the entire briefing into something far bigger than a local dispute. And the first minute alone made it obvious this wasn't going to be another careful scripted political message. This was a warning shot aimed at the highest levels of Minnesota leadership, delivered in front of the nation. But to understand why the moment hit so hard, you have to look at what pushed the situation to this boiling point. What began as a tragic incident on the streets of Minneapolis spiraled into a national flashpoint. A federal enforcement operation ended with the death of a local resident, triggering protests, anger, and demands for accountability. Communities were shaken, families were grieving, and everyone from lawmakers to activists to state officials scrambled to control the narrative. Noem stepped into that chaos with a message that blended sympathy with fury. She began by acknowledging the loss of life and offering condolences to the victims' loved ones, recognizing the pain and grief spreading across the community. But almost immediately after, she shifted sharply. The tone transformed from somber to scorching. She accused Minnesota leaders not only of mismanaging the situation but of actively inflaming it. She claimed the state's highest officials chose politics over safety, ideology over cooperation, and rhetoric over responsibility. And in her retelling, this wasn't an isolated mistake. It was part of a pattern she said had left residents vulnerable, law enforcement unsupported, and criminals emboldened. She pointed directly at Governor Tim Walz, arguing that his public statements weren't just wrong but deliberately provocative. She repeated his claim that the federal agents involved weren't even law enforcement, and she didn't mince words in calling it a lie. According to Noem, denying their legitimacy didn't just disrespect the officers, it encouraged hostility toward them. It gave agitators and violent actors a green light, and in her view, it tore at the foundation of public trust. But then she went further, much further. She accused Minnesota leadership of using inflammatory labels, words she said had real consequences. When Walz allegedly referred to federal officers as the Gestapo, Noem argued that this wasn't metaphor or criticism, it was fuel poured onto an already burning fire, language intended to turn ordinary citizens against agents trying to enforce the law, words designed, she said, to delegitimize their presence and spark resistance. And that's where the briefing took a darker turn. Noem claimed that leaders in Minnesota had done more than criticize federal agencies. She said they had doxed officers, exposing their personal information, identities, and potentially their family members to danger. According to her, this wasn't political disagreement, it was endangerment, a direct threat to the safety of the agents and the people closest to them. For viewers watching live, this section didn't feel like political theater. It felt like a serious allegation being delivered with absolute certainty, and the weight of it pushed the conversation out of Minneapolis and into the national arena. But she wasn't finished. Next, Noem accused state officials of refusing to cooperate with federal law enforcement requests, including situations involving individuals wanted for violent offenses. She framed it as obstruction, claiming that Minnesota leaders protected people who should have been in custody, shielding them from federal agents and allowing dangerous individuals to remain in the community. It was a claim guaranteed to ignite controversy. And she didn't soften the blow. She argued that these decisions weren't just misguided, they were reckless. In her view, they allowed violent offenders to remain free and created an environment where tragedies weren't just possible, they were inevitable. But then came the allegation that sent reporters scrambling for follow-up questions. She claimed that under the governor's watch, tens of billions of taxpayer dollars had vanished, stolen in what she described as a historic, unprecedented scandal. Money meant for critical programs, public infrastructure, and community support, gone. And while some argued the governor was simply unaware, Noem implied something much more serious, that he may have allowed it to happen, or even enabled it in certain cases. This wasn't a routine criticism of budget mismanagement. This was a direct accusation of overseeing one of the largest fraud schemes in state history, and the timing of the claim, delivered during a moment of national attention, ensured the controversy would spread instantly. The room erupted with questions, but Noem wasn't slowing down. Instead, she widened the lens. She reminded reporters that Minneapolis wasn't the only place where federal officers worked with local governments, and in other cities, she said, cooperation made communities safer, not more chaotic. She pointed to Memphis, a city with a Democratic mayor who worked openly with federal agencies. According to her, the partnership didn't create tension. It reduced murder rates by half. It brought stability to neighborhoods. And it proved, she argued, that leadership, not party affiliation, determined public safety outcomes. The contrast was deliberate. She wasn't criticizing Minnesota in isolation, she was presenting it as an outlier, an example of what happens when political leaders choose confrontation over cooperation, when rhetoric replaces strategy, when ideology becomes more important than security. As she continued, her tone sharpened again. She argued that Minnesota's leadership had created an environment where violence flourished and trust evaporated. According to her, this wasn't the fault of federal agents, it wasn't the fault of community members, it was the result of decisions made at the top, decisions, she said, endangered residents and undermined law enforcement. And when she addressed the Minneapolis mayor, her message was just as direct. She accused the city's leadership of mirroring the governor's mistakes, of amplifying distrust, defending individuals who posed threats, and refusing to acknowledge the consequences. But the most gripping part of her message wasn't the accusations themselves, it was the urgency behind them. She framed Minnesota as a warning to the rest of the country, a real-time example of what happens when political grievances override common sense, and when leaders choose to escalate instead of unify. By the time she reached the end of the briefing, the tone had shifted once more, not to softness, but to finality. She reminded the public that violence wasn't inevitable, cooperation wasn't impossible. The problem, she said, was leadership. Decisions made behind microphones in press conferences and on social media were shaping the real world in ways far more dangerous than most people realized. And then she delivered her final message, a message meant not only for reporters, not only for Minneapolis, but for anyone watching across the country. Actions have consequences, and so do words. If you think this story ends here, it doesn't. The backlash, the investigations, the political fallout, those chapters are still unfolding, and the confrontation between federal and state leadership is far from over. What happens next may reshape how the nation understands law enforcement cooperation, public safety, and the power of political rhetoric. If you want the full breakdown of how this situation escalated, the hidden details behind the scenes, and what insiders say could happen next, make sure you're subscribed. Hit the like button, turn on notifications, and stay tuned, because this story is only just beginning, and you don't want to miss what comes next.